So today, the topic is the critical role of groundwater for wetlands in a warming world with Professor Jenny Davis. She's a freshwater ecologist here in the Research Institute for the Environment and Livelihoods. And she has worked on global wetland issues, including hydrological change, habitat loss, and pollution. Her current research seeks to understand the processes supporting the persistence of aquatic biota and refugia. So, Jenny, thank you very much for volunteering, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. No,
I'll just leave the trick
nothing is moving.
now.
I always like to start with acknowledgements because otherwise I might forget by the end. Oh, no, back to it. Sorry. And I'm particularly grateful for the traditional owners and rangers of the country where I've been able to do research on waterholes. I also want to acknowledge that even though I'm the person giving this talk, I really value the inputs I've had from colleagues, from students, and a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about is research that's been done, obviously, as various kinds of projects, including student projects. And also we've had funding from a wide range of places. So I'm going to talk about wetlands, I'm going to talk about groundwater, I'm going to talk about a warming world, and hopefully by the end you'll see that there's a coherent thread here. But bear with me. So what are wetlands? I've put up the Ramsar definition of a wetland because this is now the one that is used worldwide, and I won't read it to you, but if you are reading it, you will see it's an all-encompassing definition. It covers all waters on the globe except the deep ocean. Why is it so encompassing? Well, when I give lectures on the Ramsar Convention to students, I say because it prevents any legal arguments that it's not a wetland. And this was particularly important in some countries, including North America, where they were filling in wetlands rapidly. They could say that that is dry sometimes, so it's definitely not a wetland. So it's an all-encompassing definition. We have 67 Ramsar sites in Australia, but we only have 2 in the Northern Territory. It's really important to have Ramsar sites because the Commonwealth commits to making sure that they are protected, but there's also money involved in managing them. So we are missing out by not having Ramsar sites. In talking about wetlands, the go-to now for me, if I want to just check what I'm talking about, is the Queensland Wetland Info website. They were funded as part of a Commonwealth Government program to protect the Great Barrier Reef. And very sensibly, they realised to protect a reef, you've got to protect the land-based water flowing onto it, the catchments. So there was a lot of mapping done in Queensland. It's gone on over a long time now, and it's really useful. So to begin with, they came up with all these different types of wetlands, all based on the Ramsar definition. And then something like 20 years ago, I think, or at least a decade ago, they added groundwater dependent ecosystems. So those systems that are really reliant on groundwater. And then in 2022, this really useful report came out by UNESCO saying, we really must take more notice of groundwater because it is really important. But they've got this little saying, making the invisible visible. I've been saying groundwater is out of sight and out of mind because it's water that's stored underground. I should say all groundwater is rain, but it could be rain that fell a very long time ago. And globally, that concern about groundwater has been expressed in things like this. This was the they were using satellite imagery and density to work out where in the globe aquifers were under pressure, and came up with, so Australia's not doing too bad. Great Artesian Basin still there at the end, although the actually pressure's dropping, but there's still water. It's the Pilbara where, in fact, things have been dewatered for mining. But of course, the concern is in some of these places, they will actually run out of groundwater. They will have overpumped those aquifers and they're not being recharged at a rate that will replenish it. Most of the work that I'm going to talk to you about is in arid Australia or semi-arid Australia. And you can see why when you get into semi-arid and arid conditions, groundwater becomes important because by definition, those systems do not have a lot of rain. And I really like this satellite imagery. You can see Australia is in fact the most arid continent in the southern hemisphere. But of course, there's extreme aridity in the northern hemisphere as well. But we really are an arid place. And these are two very old graphics now, but I use them because I think I like them because they're simple. So arid and semi-arid regions put out by BOM a long time ago. You can see how much of inland Australia, well, 70% is arid and semi-arid. And if you look at that figure over on the right-hand side, not that easy to see, but it's only the dark blue that are permanent rivers, permanently flowing rivers. And it's got to be a very dark red to be a permanent lake. So we have lots of river systems in Australia that flowed back when things were wetter, but are not flowing permanently now. As I said, low rainfall, particularly when you get to the arid regions, lots of evaporation. Something like 40% of Australia's export earnings come from arid Australia, but most of that is probably iron ore from the Pilbara. And then hardly any of us live in arid places. BOM have really started to pick up things about groundwater and make them publicly accessible. So you can go to BOM now and find all this information, which is great. But of course, when you want to work on at a particular place, that kind of national approach still has some holes in it. But it's a good start. The groundwater dependent atlas, ecosystems atlas that you can now look at in BOM, not doing too badly for aquatic ecosystems. You can see there, although if you read the if you do read the legend, how much we know versus how much we think there might be potentially groundwater ecosystems there's still quite a difference. When you get to terrestrial ecosystems, which are a lot of the plants that are important to us and important as part of ecosystems, our mapping is not as comprehensive, and poor old NT is still way behind the 8 ball. And then when you get to subterranean ecosystems, things that are living underground in the groundwater, it's really only Queensland where they've actually mapped it. So there's a lot of gaps to fill in still. In terms of talking about climate, I don't think anyone here would dispute the fact that we're warming as a planet. And then I've been mainly using CSIRO and BOM information now. It's a great source of information. So basically we're warming, there's no dispute about it, and our rainfall patterns are changing. So less rainfall now in the southern Australian winter. In the north, in the wet season, there's an indication we might be getting more rainfall, but we're also getting more potential fire days. So more than 10 years ago now, I was involved in a big research program that was funded by a previous federal Labor government, where they were taking climate change very seriously, and they put quite a bit of money into this, the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. And because I'd already been working on waterholes, mainly in Central Australia, I was leading the arid zone approach. And it was great funding. We got, I think as though we got some really important work done. And so there's a number of reports that are on the web. And then there's this paper, which is one of my personally career highlights. For me, I'm just very proud of it because I just like the way it all came together, and also it appears to be quite useful. So I was looking at this concept of refuges or refugia. And already some work had been done. Most of it had been done in the Northern Hemisphere on plants and how there'd been refuges during the Ice Age, and then the plant communities had expanded out. So that went back to the Pleistocene. I was, of course, more interested in the waterholes in very arid places as refuges, and this concept that if you have a habitat that's decoupled from the regional climate, that could then be a future refuge because you're not relying on rainfall and you may stay cooler. And in fact, that's what we found when we started looking at that concept and applying it to our arid zone waterholes. So we came up with this concept of evolutionary refugia, and we were mainly basing it on where we found very restricted distributions of species, aquatic invertebrates and fish in particular. We found that the source of water was groundwater. Groundwater is decoupled. It's water that's been stored from previous rainfall, so it's decoupled. And it sits at the mean soil temperature for that region, mean annual soil temperature. So it is thermally buffered. We found that things that live, and this is one of the sites in South Australia, so it's part of the Great Artesian Basin discharge. Things that live there are very resistant to things happening, but if you dry that system out, those species will go extinct because they don't have mechanisms to return. So we say they're resistant, but they're not resilient. So they can't fly, flying things will turn up, but the basic core endemic or literal fauna is very restricted. So you need to protect the groundwater catchments and specific water bodies to ensure that these systems will persist into the future. In contrast, there's lots of water out in the arid zone, often water holes in those dry rivers that you saw, and they vary enormously in space and time. They're usually rain-fed, but quite often they do get a bit of groundwater. And the things that live there are part of what is called a boom and bust ecology. So when times are good, there's plenty of water, and of course Lake Eyre would be the classic example. When things are booming, there's masses of birds, there's masses of food for the birds to eat, and then when it all dries out, that's the bust. Everything contracts back. But because they're mobile, they can get around the landscape. So to make sure those kind of habitats persist into the future, the most important thing for rivers is connectivity. That fish actually need to move from waterhole to waterhole. Doesn't matter if the location of the waterhole changes, but if you put a dam in or take a lot of water away, put a road across it even without thinking about how that water's flowing, you could in fact you could send some things into local extinctions. So a question that I'm continuing to try and answer are where are the water bodies which are likely to be future refugia, and what are the sources of water that support these systems? And so the first thing that I was introduced to by Niels Muntsgaard, who used to be here in ECMU, was the concept of using isotope hydrology. And I love isotope hydrology. That's probably because I don't know a lot about it. It's much better to be ignorant. It's a wonderful tool. So I don't know all its failings. But the thing that I really liked was if you collect the water samples, it doesn't matter how you treat them. So it's great for a citizen science project, which is what we ran, because it didn't matter if people went to a waterhole, collected 50 mils of water for us, and then left it in their car in 40-degree heat for 2 weeks. The isotopes are quite stable, whereas if we're trying to measure pH or nutrients, it would be hopeless. We couldn't do it. So we did start a citizen science project funded by a territory NRM down in Central Australia. We called it the Outback Water Project. All the samples were measured here. And it was really a fun project. So those are the two, we've got 240 water samples spanning quite a great area. And the reason it was important to make it a citizen science project was, as a researcher, I could never hope to go to all these sites. The cost of driving there and the time it would take, it was never going to happen. But we found that people did embrace this. The local tourist centre in Alice Springs were more than happy to give out these little kits that we provided, and the tourism operators actually they took people down to the waterhole and said, let's collect some water. So we did get lots of samples, and 75% were collected by citizen scientists. And this is why isotope hydrology is so valuable. So we've got deuterium, H2, plotted on the left-hand side, the y-axis, and oxygen 18. On the x-axis, there's a global, it's called a meteoric climb, because there's a linear relationship between those two isotopes in rainfall. I like to call it the rainfall line because it makes more sense to me personally. And the further you deviate from that rainfall line indicates how much evaporation is occurring in the water body that you took that samples from. So all the sites that are sitting down near this bottom end of the plot were our springs. And of course there were repeated samples and they tended just to be in the same spot. So that was a double thing there. So that was groundwater. So really, even though it's coming out of the ground at that point, it still isn't, and it's very shaded where it is, it hasn't really been affected by evaporation. You get into more of the water holes in the West Max, and there's a fair bit of evaporation going on, but there's still some groundwater. And then you get up into these other water holes. That's a very temporary water body in Wataka National Park, Kings Canyon, that I know dries out. It's dry most of the year. So the data fitted what we knew already of those water holes, but it was great to get that information. So that's been published. And out of that, we said, well, there are 20 water bodies that are completely groundwater dominated. So if you had to make priorities about what you would manage for future protection of fauna in particular in that area, that's where you concentrate your efforts. Luckily, they were all in national parks or Indigenous protected areas, which was fantastic. And then walkers on the Larapinta Trail actually gave us 7 unrecorded things. And I suspect if we continue to do this kind of project, we're in other parts of the NT. So it was a win-win project, basically. I just want to quickly mention camera traps because we've also been using those since 2014 down at Wataka National Park. And someone said recently, don't keep calling it Wataka, call it Kings Canyon, and then everyone will know where it is. I could give hours of seminars on our images from those camera traps, but I just want to say they're really useful at these kind of sites because the water bodies are so small. So the camera, and now people use acoustic sensors as well, but you're getting pretty much everything that's coming in to drink. And that was the question I realised. I'd started off working on aquatic invertebrates, what was in the water, but once I pretty well surveyed these sites several times, I thought I need to know more about them. Actually, what's using this water? What vertebrate fauna is coming in using this water? And so the camera traps have given us a huge amount of information. And of course, in Australia, we don't do monitoring over time all that well, particularly not of fauna. It's starting to be done better now that there are acoustic sensors and camera traps. But it certainly wasn't when I started. And Simon Botto has actually worked up the bird data as part of his PhD. So the only other thing I want to talk to you about from that research is this paper that was using 15 months worth of data from when we started in 2014, and Simon did it for his honours project. And what we found there, and it was a particularly hot time down in Central Australia, and what we found is that granivores, so those are birds that eat seeds. So the classic granivore is a zebrafinch. And because their diet is so dry, they have to come and drink all the time. In fact, if you hear them chattering away when you're out driving somewhere through an arid place, you know you're near water. They won't leave water all that far. So they come in as a flock. And they were on the water, the 2 springs that we're looking at, or 2 groundwater fed systems we looked at all the time, regardless of what the temperature was. But then for carnivores, the raptors, and there's a brown goshawk and a collared sparrowhawk in this slide here, they started to come in much more often when the temperature got to 30 degrees. And the same with omnivores, things who, so these 3, carnivores, omnivores and nectarivores, can all get their water from their diet until things start to get really hot. And it would make sense. So once it got to about 30 degrees C, they were coming in. And then finally the things that were getting nectar, so lots of water in their diet, once it got to 35 degrees. So their upper thermal limit was getting very close to being reached. They had to come in to cool down. What we found from Simon analysing the data is that the big raptors would come and sit in these water bodies for 20 to 30 minutes at a time, which they would never do when it's cooler. And they were excluding things like the zebra finches. So you could predict as things warm up, and things are going to warm up in Central Australia, we're going to have competitive exclusion. So there's going to be a change in the dynamics of that system. How it will play out, I don't know, but I think it's fairly reasonable to predict there will be a lot of competition for water as things get hotter. Right, now I want to sort of move a bit up the territory from the Central Australia, and thanks to Dylan for providing this wonderful graphic. So here in the territory, we provide something like, for most of the territory, 90% of the water that we depend on comes from groundwater. That's a big number. And I'd already sort of said we were very dependent on groundwater, but this kind of graphic just brings it home to you, how essential groundwater is to us as people, culturally, and to ecosystems. So, of course, I think it was about 2016, fracking became the issue. The Labor government had got in on a no fracking policy platform, and the story is within about 8 weeks of being in government, they were told by the Commonwealth, fracking has to proceed. So they said, well that's very tricky politically, I can imagine. We'll have a moratorium. So companies can come and explore, but they can't actually produce and sell gas till we've undertaken an inquiry. And Alan, is he somewhere, was part of the inquiry. It's colloquially known as the Pepper Inquiry. And so in 2018, that inquiry produced a report that had 135 recommendations that had to be met by 2023 before fracking could proceed. So that report, those recommendations, and it depends who you talk to, basically government has said those recommendations have been met. There's still disagreement about a small number of those recommendations, and I won't go into that now. So this region is the Beetaloo gas region. So it's south of Katherine down to about Elliot. So that became important. So because I'd done most of my research in Western Australia, I was well aware of the issue of groundwater biota, known as stygofauna, in the Pilbara, and how important it was for mining companies to actually know what was there, monitor it, and have offsets. And the Pilbara has fractured rock aquifers, and when they dewater to mine, they're actually drying up some aquifers, so they're not connected. And so they're sending species of stygofauna extinct, basically. So I thought, well, we should try and work out whether we've got stygofauna here. And so we were funded by Jazeera, and this is myself, Steph, who was one of Alan's postdocs and did a wonderful job on this project, and Gavin Rees and Daryl Nielsen from CSIRO. Here we are trying to look pretty excited about pumping water out of holes in the ground, which when you've gone to lovely ferny springs, isn't quite as attractive. Anyway, so we undertook the first survey to see whether there was a subterranean biota in the area that was potentially going to be drilled for onshore gas. What do we find? Well, we found a whole new food web. And I have to say, as an ecologist, I found that extremely exciting. How many places in the world can you find a whole new food web? Admittedly, if you're looking at invertebrates, the probability is higher. But it was wonderful. And it was interesting because before we went out and did the sampling, so we had 26 bores basically down the Stewart Highway and across a bit, people had said to me, oh, people have looked, there's nothing out there. But then after we found stuff, other people said, oh yeah, we knew stuff was there. So to prove, you have to go and do some sampling. And this is that classic stygofauna. So they're living underground, there's no light. So they've got no colour. And they're blind, because there's no point in having eyes when you have no light. And they're relying, and it's quite a simple food chain, but the crustacean at the top, the only thing that has been described, Parisia unguis, it's predatory. Sorry, what was I going to say that? It's a very simple food chain, but they're all relying on organic material being leaching down from plant material on the surface. So it's a really interesting system. And we were very lucky that that specimen, Parisia, had been found in the Cutter Caves and a couple of other caves. It had been described, lodged with the NT Museum, and there was a Commonwealth program to sequence all type specimens, so it had been sequenced. And this proved to be really important because that meant we could do some population genetics. It was the CSIRO lab that did this, and find that we had one population from across the entire area that we'd sampled. And that said, this is a connected aquifer, which is very different to the Pilbara, where those fractured rock aquifers aren't connected. And that's what you would expect for a karst limestone system. CSIRO had done other studies with chemicals, traces, that had found the same thing. So we now have multiple lines of evidence to say this is a connected aquifer. And of course, the risk when you're doing something in this kind of aquifer, like onshore gas, is that the contamination is the thing that you're worried about, because if you have a spill or a well cracks, and the chemicals used in fracking are designed to stop things growing on the sides of the well, so they're toxic to fauna. Why does that matter? Some people have said to me, they're just a little bunch of creepy crawlies, and I don't even want to think that they're in my water supply. They are part of an ecosystem service that is keeping that water in a certain quality. You remove in any system, you go in and start to play around with the food chain, you'll change the microbes that were being grazed into something else, and ultimately that system will become downgraded. So it is important. So the conservation challenge for working with these kind of groundwater systems, and we wrote up an article for the conversation, and in that we said, well, there are 11 new species that we know of, but of course that was probably, there's more than 11, but that was from our 26 pilot study bores. Those species need to be described in some way, even if it's only sequencing, because as it's been pointed out, if you don't know what you've got there, you can't protect it, you can't conserve it. Sorry, I want to go back to that slide. I've put in 2 proposals with ABRS, which are the main Commonwealth funding for taxonomy. Both of them were rejected. ABRS has hardly any money, I know that. But even so, it's quite depressing. I won't try again, and it would take a team of people to describe these organisms, species, but it should be done. So the other thing, picture there is I was trying to get a visual picture of what these organisms are living in. So that's what the tufa limestone looks like. It's just an outcrop. It's got lots of holes in it. In some cases, there are caves. When those caves collapse, they become sinkholes, and they are where the groundwater is recharged in that system. And people have talked about underground rivers, and I suspect there may be, because in some places, near Catherine, where they put dye in, they came out pretty quickly into the Catherine River. But I still think this thing about an undescribed fauna is a fauna at a high risk of being ignored and completely lost is a very pertinent comment on what we're facing now in much of the Northern Territory when it comes to invertebrates. So the challenge is, how do we protect these systems? Well, groundwater-dependent ecosystems, I've said, have now been recognised for something like 20 years. But they are out of sight and out of mind. Interestingly, in other places of the world, like Europe, karst systems now are well recognised as being very vulnerable systems. They have lots of groundwater, so they're very useful to people. They provide a lot of groundwater, but you can pollute them very easily. So at a REBS meeting that happened to be in Brisbane, they decided you could nominate karst and cave systems as Ramsar wetlands. And then 1999, they came out with actual guidelines. So Eric and I had a go, Eric Garcia and I had a go at seeing if we could fit the Ramsar guideline, if we could nominate the Tyndall limestone aquifer subterranean ecosystem as a Ramsar site. And at the moment, we've come to the conclusion it's too difficult because you have to have the agreement of all stakeholders. I'll just let that one rest with you. However, we think we could nominate it as a threatened ecological community. And we've been talking to people in Canberra and they said, yes, send in a submission. But they said, you have to prove it's threatened. Is there something threatening going on? And they said, really, that means that something has already happened. And that's actually quite tricky until very recently, and that will be something I'll show you in a minute. So, the other thing is, go back. Very, very recently, back in September, you could go along to the Songlines Art Gallery on the Stuart Highway and you could look at this wonderful map that people have done from Southeast Arnhem Land of the entire Roper system. It's cultural mapping. I could see in the art gallery they'd marked where all the springs were, which were far beyond where I knew springs were, and they'd marked the songlines of all the important animals. Now, there is no book or public there is no book or public ability, I think, to look at this without being involved in. It's not publicly available, but you can. I hope it may do. So that I just wanted to say the concept of cultural groundwater and this Indigenous understanding of how intertwined things are when it comes to groundwater is enormously important, and we seem to have been quite good at ignoring it. So Elsie National Park, so we've gone down the Stuart Highway, this is Mataranka. Some of the groundwater dependent systems there have been mapped in this report that the Environment Centre commissioned, so that's a good start. I love being there, but what I really wanted to what I want to put out to you is that blue light climate that is associated with most karst limestone springs anywhere in Australia and the world. So that's Bitter Springs. And then I was down there in June with my friend who was snorkeling there that I took a photo of, and we were asked if we go across to Gilminkin, which is outside Elsie National Park. It's the Aboriginal community there. Because a couple of the ladies, the traditional owners, said we are really concerned about this spring, which is there, the blue spring there where it says August 2021. It's lost its blue colour. It lost it when a big flood came through in January, something wrong. So there's something going on with surface water, and it hasn't come back. And I contacted a person 2 days ago and said, has the blue returned? And they said no. So my initial thoughts, so I sampled it. Luckily, I'd been there in August 2021. We'd been taken there when we were doing other big blue surveys, and the ranger coordinator said, come and have a look at this spring, it's really important. So I took a photo. So I knew it was blue back then because people have been saying, oh, those people don't know what they're talking about. It was a blue spring, and they'd said it never lost its colour. I initially thought it was eutrophication from agricultural activity upstream, because usually when you get green water, it's a phytoplankton bloom, but it was actually filamentous algae, which is down there in that right-hand corner. The water itself is really clear, regardless of whether it looks blue or looks green. But when it looks green, it's because you're looking through the clear water and seeing the benthic algae. And it's just the same species that occurs in the Roper and the Daly, so it's common to that area. So I'm still trying to understand. I think I know what's happened from a chemical viewpoint, but I don't know why it happened. So next slide, I came back, looked on some sentinel imagery, and sure enough, you can see where groundwater is being used, close to Mataranka. So there's a mango farm that's been there for a decade now, but very recently, 2 years ago, apparently what was a sandalwood plantation, sorry, I used the pointer, that's now a melon and pumpkin plantation. So they removed the sandalwoods because they weren't apparently profitable and planted melons and pumpkins. And so my initial concept was, well, whenever you start a new crop in an area where you don't really know what the soils and conditions are like, you would probably over-fertilise and overwater. But I have no proof of that. I am increasingly concerned, though, that that blue spring in Elsie Creek has lost its groundwater. It's got cooler, and that groundwater is always warm. And the reason it's blue is its crystals, calcite crystals, are actually dissolved in the water. So you've got that supersaturated calcium carbonate water coming up through that calcium limestone bed, and those crystals dissolved in the water are just reflecting sunlight. So that's why you have blue water. Something's happened to change that chemical process. Any thoughts on that matter would be very welcome. The problem is we don't have any pre-impact data, and it makes life much, much harder. We do have some eDNA data and some isotope data that will be processed, but it hasn't been done yet. So I just wanted to say karst limestone systems are very vulnerable to over-extraction and pollution. The top half of the Beetaloo, the Tyndall limestone aquifer, is very vulnerable. There's a lot more information now than there's ever been. The Schreiber that came out last year is a very useful document. I've reread it several times, and every time I go back to it, there's more in it. Within that, in chapter 10, they've drawn a nice boundary saying this is a really important area, we should protect it. So it's Elsie Creek, it does go up to past Chilmican, and it's all of the Upper Roper and Elsie National Park. What is wrong with this diagram? Sorry, I'm treating you like a group of students. You can't draw a line on a map and say you've protected the aquifer, because it's underground. And that's why I've included that, again, a very old figure of the Cambrian limestone aquifer, the Tyndall bits in the top half. You've got to go much further back in that aquifer to protect that particular system. And of course, that is difficult to do. We've been treating groundwater as if it's a never-ending supply. Well, now down in South Australia, things are going pear-shaped around Mount Gambier. And they've been monitoring. And they know the water table's been declining, and they had massive algal blooms apparently this year. That was what was written up in The Guardian on Sunday, and they had to close it for swimming and diving. Piccaninny Ponds is just the most wonderful blue site to go to. What worries me enormously is they've been monitoring, but that didn't stop it from becoming a problem, for actually having something bad happen. So that's the warning there. We recognise there's something like 42,000 bores are registered in the NT. You can go on to NR Maps and look at them. They all will have how salty or fresh they are, because that's what you need to have a bore that you want, because you want that fresh water. But there's only something like 1% of them have water quality data. So we recognised 2 years ago now that there was a knowledge gap. We wrote up a proposal, and we're very grateful that the Ian Potter Foundation, Northern Hub and Inspired NT funded it. We're running this with an app and a website. We provide sampling kits. It's all free. We're currently distributing them because I'd learned from that citizen science project in Central Australia that it's the best way potentially to get a lot of water coming back in. And with the two things that we're measuring, the isotopes and the eDNA, which is preserved on site, it's fairly robust to what people might do to those samples. Whereas there are other forms of water quality monitoring that are not. That's Erica, Anna, who was Dylan's master student from Flinders, and one of our students, Kate, and that was bore number 1, ground zero. So we've done a pilot study, and we went down to her bore just south of Berry Springs, took samples, and I'm currently working up that data. So back to the beginning, and this is the last slide. That report, we really do need to start making the invisible visible. we need to be much more strategic about how we monitor groundwater, and Dylan's been involved in some of this work. That's one of his author of one of those papers. So monitoring and reporting is essential, but different to other things in the environment, you can't just allocate an amount of water, and usually the pressure is to allocate a very large amount of water and say, here it is, have it, and we'll monitor. And if anything starts to go wrong, we'll do something. By the time your monitoring is telling you that something's going wrong, if trees have died, if the vegetation has died, if things have gone extinct, it's far too late. So with groundwater, I think and again, I'm not a hydrologist, so please ask Dylan questions if you want to know more, but my rule of thumb is now, if you're going to allocate groundwater, you start with a smaller amount than the model tells you. And in fact, that has now been decided for Singleton Station. I think they're starting with something like 50% of what the modelling said they could use. And then you monitor. And if the trees, which are very groundwater dependent, don't die, if other things that you're monitoring don't die, if the water level isn't dropping at a great rate, then perhaps you could have more water. But that's the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is something I think, and people just roll their eyes when you mention the precautionary principle, unless you are working in a conservation sphere. But for the Northern Territory, where our systems are still intact, particularly our aquatic systems, we should be applying it. And that's the thing that really worries me, is that not only is groundwater use and potential pollution for fracking an issue, of course there's also the cotton issue of very large amounts of water may need to be used, is that some of these industries will come in, will use a lot of water and clear a lot of land, and for various reasons they may fail. And I guess Fog Dam is always, the failed rice at Fog Dam is always waved around, and the Ord River is still not developing at the rate they always thought the Ord River over in WA would develop. So massive amount of loss of savanna woodland, disruptions of our aquatic systems, and then people might walk away, and those systems can't be restored to what they were. So that's what worries me. Any questions? Hopefully you finished on time.
You, Jenny, that was wonderful in time. Yeah, we're open for questions. Are you happy to coordinate the people here, Jenny? We have about 30 participants online. Yep. So for the online participants, please write in the chat box the questions and we're going to read it. Anyone to start? One online. Oh, here we got one. Go ahead.
So, Jenny, I'm actually kind of a karst hydrologist, a former cave explorer.
Good.
Yeah. So I've never heard of a subterranean wetland. Could you tell me exactly what a subterranean?
Water underground that has some kind of discrete character. Like you've got to know what its boundary is. So a cave with water in it would be a subterranean wetland. It's a very simple concept.
How is that different from just simple groundwater?
Because it's got a whole. It's got a biota. It's got a fauna. It's got microbes. It's got fungi. It's got viruses. There's a whole little community in there.
Yeah.
And functioning.
Right.
And it would be so easy to either dewater and just get that would then disappear if it's not connected, or you would start to change it in certain pollutions. So Ramsar have said people need to be aware that we have underground systems that function in a biological way, not just water sitting there. I mean, karst limestone is particularly likely to have subterranean wetlands because it has those big spaces, and it's, water can move more freely.
So we really have 2 Ramsar listed wetlands in the territory. Is that an issue of the research hasn't been done and the people haven't been around to propose more wetlands, essentially?
I sort of made a promise to myself that I wouldn't say anything political when I gave this talk. I wanted
Good luck with that.
I wanted the data and the research to be up front, So I'm not an environmental activist, I'm an environmental researcher. But many years ago, I did say to someone in the Northern Territory government, when I was working in Central Australia, these sites that I was working on there would be fantastic Ramsar sites. And the response at that time, which could have been 30 years ago now, was we don't want another layer of bureaucracy telling us what to do with our wetlands. And I can understand why people would say that, but of course there was a recent government program where if you had a Ramsar listed wetland, you've got a whole lot of money to build fences around it and control pigs and cattle. And so it would be useful to have them nominated, but you are committing to an international convention that says you will protect it. And it's got harder and harder to get everyone to agree to protecting something when they might have an interest in doing something that would not protect it. It's not just NT government, but it would help. There's plenty of examples of where we could have. And Angus Duke and others did a report in 2005 on they mapped all the arid zone wetlands of southern NT and said some of these would be excellent nominations for a Ramsar site. But so we've got data, but the political will, and some parts of the community will not be there, I think.
Yeah, I suppose that's going to be part of my question is, has there been kind of an inventory of the wetlands and which ones do meet Ramsar quality? It's useful in my research at the moment because I acknowledge that in a recent wind resource assessment report by the Northern Territory government, they put a 100-kilometre exclusion buffer around Ramsar sites for looking at development. So I'm trying to map future conservation opportunities as well as what we currently know. So it'd be useful to know which wetlands I could apply maybe that 100-kilometre buffer to.
Criteria are quite, they're on the web. Might make a good master's project.
Yeah. But that research you just mentioned, I might get you to.
It would be easy to do.
Yeah.
Except I don't think anyone.
I think I can just use what's known for now. It would be good.
Yeah.
But
I mean, Ramsar was always about water birds, but then they brought in a whole new list of things. So if you've got endemic and relictual populations of things, that really helps.
Yeah, and also with the that boundary around Mataranka Springs, I know part of the role of the Cereba and also the petroleum reserve policy was to apply appropriate buffers to areas that needed to be excluded from fracking. How would you go about kind of deciding on an appropriate exclusion zone around Mataranka, understanding it's connected to other water systems and things like that? Is there a way of going about that, do you think?
Well, as I said, once you start dealing with the groundwater resource, the water sources, but you can, I mean, again, Dylan can tell you it just costs money to do some very sophisticated analysis to really work out where the water's coming from. And SARA have already done a fair bit of that work. And then you work out, well, once you know your water sources, you've got to protect them. So how far back you go. Then you've got to set up a trial thing where you are pumping, because once you start removing groundwater, it changes what's going on locally with how that water's moving. That's my simplistic interpretation. So just saying, if we even protect this much of the aquifer, once you start pumping, and if you start pumping a lot, the aquifer conditions will change, characteristics will change, isn't that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, yeah, with the situation of where the Beetaloo Basin is and where Mataranka is, yeah, if anything goes wrong and water's moving that way, there's not much you can do about that other than to monitor. And one of the papers that Jenny had up there was about trigger levels. So it might be you monitor this bore for this thing, and you have a plan of what you would do if it's encountered. If we actually see elevated levels of whatever at this location, our response to that will be to pump and treat to whatever, and you would want to have those plans in place. So that would be my suggestion of what gets rolled out. But yeah, so observations is key.
And it costs money. And at the moment, as far as I can tell, I don't think the industry's paying for it. It all comes back to the NT government, which we know needs money for schools and hospitals and everything else. So it's a real issue for the NT. How do you actually fund this kind of what's needed?
So we pump water out of the ground to use for agriculture and other reasons. In these arid areas, are there restoration opportunities to create refugia in arid zones by actually pumping up groundwater? I mean, they're such important. Well,
there's aquifer recharge where they, people do actually put. I mean, WA's been into that for quite some time now, but that's a completely.
So your concept of refugia, could you actually create refugia in arid zones by bringing up groundwater?
You could, but the cost of doing that way outweigh.
Yeah,
And the other issues with arid zone waterholes are they're being trashed by cattle and camels and
yeah,
things like that. But if you started to restore them, which they're doing in some places, and protect them, and vegetation, part of Simon's PhD was vegetation around waterholes really important. So replanting is always important. So there are strategies.
yeah.
And you could artificially water, but it is tricky. You've got to get the right water chemistry. And I know a lot was being done with wetlands in WA on the Swan Coastal Plain when I was there, and the first lot of recharge wasn't helping any wetland, but I think they've got quite sophisticated. Online? Yes, sorry.
Online question. Do you think the thinking around monitoring is often limited in the sense that it is not routinely linked to thresholds, response plans, and communication plans?
And do I think it's not? Yes, monitoring is given lip service. That's my experience. And that's just not good enough when we're dealing with a really intact set of ecosystems in the Northern Territory, particularly from an aquatic perspective. So at the moment, we don't have dams, we don't have massive groundwater withdrawal, unless perhaps Alice Springs Town Water Supply might fit that one. But anyway, we really have intact ecosystems. We've got this massive savanna woodland. My opinion of the cattle industry changed enormously when I flew from Katherine across to one of our sites that was nearly in the Gulf, and I saw just how much woodland was out there. So cows are just wandering around eating grass. I know they can trash waterholes. I know they can trash riparian zones. But compared to the kind of thing I've seen in the West Australian wheat belt, where every tree had been removed for an area the size of Victoria, we've still got these wonderfully intact systems. And we may have issues with feral animals in particular and invasive grasses, but we're still dealing with really... So for me, when you do a risk assessment, the likelihoods of some things happening might be low, but the consequences of losing that biodiversity for all time are really high. So, and most management is around risk, especially at the Commonwealth level. It's really important to have listed species. So you asked about Ramsar wetlands, but your finding of Julia's finding of the spear-toothed shark, the fact there's Gulf snapping turtle and sawfish in the Roper, the upper Roper, triggers the EPBC Act. So the Commonwealth have to look into what's going on, even though it isn't a Ramsar site. And that's wonderful. We need more. We need to know more about things that are rare and vulnerable. So they are listed.
Any more questions?
Yeah, maybe I just probably worth mentioning, Jenny. So we've talked about the importance of monitoring and fracking, and so it's probably worth mentioning that the government has actually put aside $10 million to develop the monitoring program. Most of it is coming to RIEL to do it. So we've got an opportunity here to develop.
That's great.
That really works.
My concerns are that I would still like some kind of independent authority set up to make sure that that data coming in is looked at every year. Because it's too easy to say we're paying for monitoring, monitoring's happening. Yes, we've got a spreadsheet, you can have a look at it if you want to, but no actual management, no response to what the data's telling you. And that's why I feel as though, and the other thing I tell my friends down south who can't understand what might be going on up here sometimes is the NT government has capability. There are good people with expert knowledge, but it has very little capacity. And I still don't know if $10 million would be enough to really do the kind of monitoring and follow through and look at have thresholds and triggers for things like groundwater and surface water that is needed.
Yeah, so the 10 mil is just to set up protocols. It's not for the longer term monitoring. That would need extra funding.
Could that be an opportunity for researchers to put in grants to then do that extra monitoring?
Well, it is, but that's, I mean, we did a lot of monitoring of wetlands on the Swan Coastal Plain for the Water Authority and the Water and Rivers Commission as consultancy projects. But because they gave us money every year, we ended up with 20 years worth of data, which was wonderful. And then sometimes they'd lose the data, but they'd contact me and say, can you just send us that data again, please? So having unions involved is really useful because you do tend to be custodians and you've got a really strong interest in understanding what the data's telling you. But I would still like to see some kind of independent group who are overseeing, and I told Lisa I wasn't going to mention Eris and Ranger, But, you know, that whole issue of uranium mining in Kakadu has been treated very, very seriously. We should be treating what's happening with water, groundwater in particular, and things that are using groundwater, potential uses of groundwater, with the same kind of seriousness. And I don't think that we are at the moment we are. That's my interpretation of what I see going on. But of course, it's something we can argue for if people are, I'm interested in arguing for it. And it wouldn't be that hard to set up. It's not an expensive thing having a couple of people meet once a year to look at data. But then you've got to also commit to acting on what that committee might tell
I
you.
feel like you can monitor till you're blue in the face, but unless you're doing something about it when you do see the changes, then.
And there used to be a whole lot of stuff about monitoring before it all went digital that was called data-rich information poor syndrome. So people would say, I've got filing cabinets full of data that I collected, but no one had actually gone and looked at the data in those sheets in the filing cabinet. So monitoring is a tricky issue because people tend to just pay lip service. All right, we probably need to